Welcome to the Tax Talk podcast and the second of a two-part mini-series with Colleen Gillam-Judd. Colleen is a certified financial planner with IG Wealth Management. For over 15 years, Colleen and her team have been creating a space for high-achieving Canadian families where they are able to find financial freedom, security, and clarity. Colleen prides herself on clearly presenting financial options in accordance with client goals, while always working to preserve the financial legacy of her clients. Colleen, thank you very much for taking some time to hop on the podcast again.
Jared. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Right on. So today we're going to be looking at kind of the overall topic of business owner goals. So we're going to kind of lay out a quick case study here and kind of refer back to that throughout. And then just kind of tie in all the questions and the information back into that case study. And hopefully it's useful to you and your business. So the case study, just very generically, we're just kind of looking at a farm family. So mom and dad are kind of getting into their early 60s, maybe starting to think about, slowing down a bit, moving on from full-time operation of that farm. They currently have one child that has been helping out for a number of years that is interested in kind of taking that farm on and moving it down the road. And then they also have another child that, has maybe gone into post-secondary, has no interest in farming. So just kind of looking at this scenario, we're going to kind of approach it as mom and dad have run the farm as unincorporated partners for a number of years now. So maybe look at potential options for incorporating and a couple of different ideas around that. So the first question we wanted to look at today is, how can business owners ensure that their personal financial goals align with their business growth goals?
Yes, that's the number one place everybody should hopefully start.
For sure.
So when we're looking at it from the farm case standpoint, usually it's a little easier for the farm families, right? Their business goals and their personal goals are very tied and connected.
For sure.
Growing the farm has been their personal ambition, and the side benefit over time was they got to make a living off of it and do their passion, which was farming. So that is easier usually for farm families.
For sure.
Where it gets more challenging there sometimes is when they start looking at that next stage of going, well, what if we didn't have to be doing this 365 days of the year? Our child's interested in farming. What kind of things do we want to do off the farm? So that's when I sit down and we have discussions of, if you got the chance to spend the winter somewhere, for example. I know everybody just loves minus 30. It's my favorite time of year. No. What would you like to do? Do you want to go to Arizona if you have friends down there? Do you want to travel? And we start there and start brainstorming what things could you see yourself spending a couple weeks. Start with a couple weeks off the farm. Let the child that's starting to take over it sort of run it, and slowly work on it that way. For business owners that are not farm families, it's having that balance of a personal life and a business life, because most of the time outside of farm families, you're not working with your spouse or your partner in the business. So there is a little more separation between the two, right?
Sure.
The business owner goes to the office or has their business that they're running and comes home, whether that is just out of the office or drives. So looking at and talking to your spouse and having a conversation of, what do we want to do and what do we want to see from a growth standpoint for the business, but what do we also want to do personally, right? Do we want to be able to go on holidays, and starting with that 1 week or 2 week of, can we go on a family vacation where you're not bringing your laptop with you and spending 70% of the vacation not on vacation, right? Starting to build those goals in while we're making those financial plans and projections for the business, going, well, what about creating some space so you can do some fun things together with your spouse or partner personally, and making sure that both those sets of goals have a fairly equal value. I have found with business owners, if your partner or your spouse doesn't feel heard on the personal side, it will affect the business growth over time.
Yeah.
You need to be on the same page.
For sure.
Yeah.
No, those are good points. And I guess it's probably going to depend, obviously, if you're having that discussion with mom and dad, they're at one juncture in life, looking to go down to Arizona, whereas child that's just taken over, he probably has slightly different goals as far as, what he wants to see out of the personal finances versus maybe growing that farm a little bit as he takes over. So always important to, sit down with the financial planner, irregardless of where you're at in the process of, either building the business or maybe starting to exit, to get that plan in place initially, and then to keep tweaking that plan as you go along.
Yeah, because they're the same conversation. It's just going to look different depending on what stage you're in, right?
For sure.
It's all, when you're starting to take over that farm, you probably are starting to enter the stage where you've got young kids that have got school, and you don't get to go away to Arizona all winter. So it's similar, but it's different.
Right.
And making sure that they are equal in their importance. It's not that it should only be discussed when you're looking at exiting. It should be discussed earlier. There'll be slightly different conversations with the same end goal in mind.
Perfect. No, that's a good point. On to the next one. So what are some common mistakes that business owners make when it comes to integrating their finances? So I know you kind of touched on this initially, maybe as that farm family, things are pretty integrated. I mean, you live on the farm, you walk out the door, and you're right to work. So things are pretty tied together. Whereas maybe if you're working in a different setting, you maybe own an office space or a retail space, there's a bit of division there physically, and that helps. But I know a lot of clients will come in and, it's always a bit of a tough conversation to kind of say, well, you're an entity and the business or the farm is an entity. And in order to kind of make both of those work, we need to have a good understanding of what both of those requires in order to operate efficiently.
Yes. I always encourage people to the best of their ability to keep it separate, whether you're incorporated or not. For whatever the business is, have a separate checking and savings, have a separate credit card, so that it makes your accountant's life easier at the end of the year.
Important.
And you get a clear picture of what are my business expenses, what are my personal expenses.
Right.
There's always going to be a little bit of overlap. That's one of the beauties of being a business owner.
Yep.
But to try to the best of your ability, clearly separate what is personal money and what is business money, so that as you're planning things down the road, you know what your personal expenses are when you are no longer the owner of that business, and what your true net income is coming to you personally.
Right.
Because sometimes when you're a sole proprietor or a partnership, it gets really easy for it to blend together. And it's hard to know, other than when you look at your tax documents at the end of the year, what did I truly make versus what were my expenses. So that's usually what I try and do, try and keep them separate. And now that online banking makes it so easy to nickname accounts, just go in, name them whatever you want.
Right.
That's what we have. The business ones are all named. The other ones say personal checking.
Okay.
Right? Keep them very separate. Some people do go as far as having them at totally different institutions, so that they just know the color of their debit card. Red one's business, blue is personal, or whatever makes it easier.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's the most common one that I see.
Okay.
Is not separating them.
And I can probably piggyback off of that from real life. I think the biggest one that I see is, in that incorporated position, maybe they have a vehicle that they own personally. So all of the expenses are being run through that business. At the end of the year, I'm charging all that back to them personally. Then we're recording some sort of mileage allowance. But I don't think people grasp the amount of dollars that they're kind of spending over the course of that fiscal period on that vehicle. And then usually what that translates into is maybe a higher than expected dividend to them. And then they're wondering, well, I only took out X dollars during the year. And then I kind of have to say, well, this was the vehicle expenses. It was offset by a little bit of mileage, and the difference, that's kind of going to you, and that's why that dividend keeps going up and up and up.
Yeah.
So yeah, having that firm line, this is business, this is personal, I think that definitely helps, irregardless of whether it's a farm or just a traditional business in town here.
It is, because it gets really tricky if you've always done that. And what I find is that people have underestimated how much their personal expenses are.
Correct.
So when they are retired or no longer own that business, it was hard to remember that fuel,
Right.
insurance, right? All those things are now 100% personal.
For sure.
So yeah.
Nope, makes sense. On to the next one. So what resources or professionals should a business owner consider when they're seeking guidance on integrating the personal and business finances?
Yes. So on every major stage for business ownership, so when you're starting out, right, first thing you need to do, come up with a business idea, obviously, but you're going to want to consult a lawyer and an accountant.
For sure.
Right at the beginning, right? Should you be a sole prop, a partnership? Should you incorporate?
Right.
And then as you go along, I come into the mix on the financial planning side to make sure that we're balancing that growth goal and the goals of the business with what you want to do personally, and making sure that we're taking the legal jargon and the accounting jargon and translating what you want to do with how do we make this technically work the best for those different avenues. And then when it's going into selling a business, whether it's a farm or not a farm business, is the big ones again are going to be lawyer, accountant, financial planner, and then depending on the business, do you need to bring someone in to evaluate what the business is worth so that you can work on over a couple of years getting the most value for that sale, whether if you have more than just a building to sell, right? Because there's all those different intangible things that you can add value to your business over time if we do it over a couple of years to make the most of that sale.
For sure. Yeah, because I know a lot of times clients will, they'll just be moving along and, all of a sudden out of the blue, an offer will come in and, should I sell? Should I not? And I mean, if we haven't had this discussion ahead of time, maybe that business isn't in the right spot tax-wise to sell. Maybe you can't take, advantage of capital gains exemption. Maybe you would put some, passive investments in there, and then you're offside on some of these rules. So having these discussions ahead of time, and I think, any good accountant worth their salt should be bringing these things to mind ahead of time and saying, you might not be even thinking about selling anytime soon, but you're getting to the point where you might go offside on some of these rules. Maybe we need to start introducing a hold company into the mixture to make sure we're on side for some of this stuff. So I think it's always important to have that accountant that's able to kind of take on some of that, forward-looking responsibilities for you as well.
Absolutely, because what I see very commonly is the business owner was a farmer or a welder or a writer, and they did a really, really good job for 10 or 15 years, and then all of a sudden they looked up and they're like, oh, I've got like 6 employees, I've got 5 trucks, I now own 4 quarters of land.
Right.
Wow, is it set up the best way possible? And those are the best problems to have, but
Sure.
make sure you have some experts that you can go talk to and go, look, like I started this out because I wanted to work for myself. I was really good at this skill set. turns out the market agreed with me. Happy days.
Yeah, for sure.
How do we make sure that this is running as efficiently as possible, and always thinking about, if I've done a really good job at this, someone's going to want to buy it.
Right.
Also great,
Exactly.
but how do we make sure that that's structured so when that day comes, you can put the for sale sign up, right? It's no
For sure.
different than a home. You want to make
Right.
sure that you've taken all the nicks out of the wall, like the house looks good, lawn looks good,
Right.
done all the weeding before you put it up for sale. It's the same thing for your business. It's going to take some prep time to keep it in the right shape for that sale. Do you have a runway that you usually, in a perfect world,
Right.
that you're like, if I had 3 years or 2 years to make the books look awesome for a sale?
I would definitely say you need at least 2 years. You know,
Mhm.
just simply for some of those exemption rules, you need that 2-year window for sure. You know, depending on, like you said, how far you've gotten down the road, you might need a bit more time just to kind of iron out some things. And, you know, I kind of like that analogy, you know, you're getting that business ready to go because, you know, I think when you get into business, I would presume most people's mindset is, you know, they enjoy it, but at the end of the day, that's probably going to be one of their bigger vehicles for retirement.
Mm-hmm.
So you should be working towards, you know, maximizing the value out of that business. So, you know, at some point in time when you've gotten fairly well established,
Yeah.
you should be kind of thinking maybe a bit more long term. What can I do? You know, can I structure things slightly different? Can I move employees this way or that way? Can I, whatever the case might be, just to maximize that value, I think. That's a big point.
It's huge, right? Because all of us really enjoy it, but at a certain point, I think all of us are going, well, like, I'd love to not work 60 hours a week.
Right.
And then I'd love to not work 40 hours a week. How do I do this where I can work 30
Sure.
or take 2 months off?
Right.
And all those things, maybe you're not when you're going to sell it, but setting it up so that it can run like that also helps for sale date.
Right. Yeah, I kind of always like to look at it. I mean, when you start out that business, you're essentially an employee of it.
Mhm.
You know, you're just there, you're working, you're trying to build it up. Then I think you get to a certain stage where you're able to hire some dependable people, and then you kind of move into more of that manager role. You're just guiding that business. But I think ultimately everybody should be trying to work into the investor stage,
Mm-hmm.
where that business can run solely by itself. It doesn't need you anymore. And then you're just kind of the one maybe making those high level decisions, and you're the one that has the capital in it. And you're just steering it down the road and right into retirement.
Yes, I know that would be my goal. Like, make it so that
Yeah,
the train stays on the tracks.
For
You're
sure.
just making sure it's heading in the right direction.
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So on to the next one. What are the key personal financial considerations for a business owner when starting or growing a business?
I think the key considerations are knowing from a non-financial standpoint, because it is still, to me, financial, how much time it's going to take,
Okay.
right? When you're starting that business out, it is not 30 hours, right? You're going to invest a huge amount of your time, and time is money and is emotional capital that's going to go into building this business. The other part is, you know, what fallback capital do you have if you have a bad quarter or a bad 6 months, or, you know, heaven forbid, a bad year, where you can still make sure that you can pay your bills to have, you know, rent, mortgage, vehicle, groceries, right? That backup stage when it's still sort of a baby business and you're just that employee growing and working, to make sure that you've built or come up with a bit of a plan B. I know right now, sometimes on social media, the adage is, make it so you've burned all the boats and you have no choice but to succeed.
Interesting.
Yeah, I personally, I don't know if I would
subscribe to that.
put it quite that much at risk, but make sure that you've taken into consideration that there's going to be ebbs and flows. So how do we build a plan for knowing that that's going to happen. There will be a slow season.
Right.
That's just the nature of
Sure.
all businesses,
Sure.
right? They have a cycle. So how do we make sure that you're protected for those first few slow moments in time?
Right. No, that makes sense. So I guess kind of tying that back into the case, so, you know, the child that's been involved, you know, he's not necessarily starting out, but he's probably growing the business. So, you know, he's probably wanting to ensure that he's got some help on the farm that can, you know, somewhat offset the knowledge that mom and dad have probably brought to that operation for a significant period of time. And, you know, just putting himself into place where he's able to, you know, continue to profit from the farm. Because at the same point in time, you know, as mom and dad transition out of the farm, they're expecting, you know, son to, you know, keep seeing some profit here to be able to kind of turn that around into their retirement. So just having a good understanding of where you're at, either at those very initial stages, or if you're kind of in this particular position, taking that business over, what are the things that you need to do to maybe replace the key employees or the key shareholders that are moving out?
Yeah, and depending on the business, this is where we can use insurance to cover that off, right?
Okay.
So if you are using our farm analogy or our farm case, our farm family, your ability to physically do the job is extremely important,
For sure.
right? So if you, on the week before harvest, break your leg, that's going to make things fairly challenging, to say the least. So if there's two options there. You can have some form of insurance, whether that's a disability type insurance, some kind of insurance to have it so you have cash that you can pay someone to do the job that you can do in 6 or 8 weeks, but you can't do today.
Right.
Or you have to have cash to be able to do that.
Correct.
Right? So until the business gets to a place that you can self-insure, now we use the term self-insure on our world of when you can just take money out of the business or out of your personal to pay for it yourself, take that hit, or do you need to pay for insurance to pay for that, right? We all have homeowner insurance, vehicle insurance, right? For when that thing happens and you pay the deductible to get insurance to cover it. So it's similar.
Okay.
The other one, especially for non-farm businesses, but I would argue is equally as important
Sure.
for farm families and farm businesses,
Okay.
is if you have a partnership, so we'll take your accounting practice, you
Sure.
have partners. If something happens to one of your partners, they pass away suddenly, a lot of times if nothing's designated, their surviving spouse or partner is now your partner in the business. You may or may not like having that person come into the business. And not necessarily because they're a bad person,
Right.
but they are not a farmer.
Right.
They are not a trained accountant. They don't know how to weld anything if you have a welding business. So we can use insurance products to make sure that that business is not substantially hindered because a key person is no longer there. Whether something tragic has happened and they have passed away, whether it's something as simple as a broken bone or any kind of in between. Looking at those what ifs is really important because, well, life happens, right? Unfortunately, that there's the great years where everything ticks along and you grow at 50% or 100%, and then
Sure.
there's the years where something goes sideways.
Definitely.
So that can be a way to sort of mitigate some of those ebbs and flows, and that's something that we spend a lot of time looking at. I know we like to talk a lot about the financial planning from a positive standpoint, right? All the fun things, the retirements, the buying a home, post-secondary, but it's also making sure that there's enough flexibility for if something unfortunate happens, someone passes away,
Right.
someone gets a critical illness, someone gets hurt, Because our greatest asset is our ability to make money,
Right.
our ability to do the job, to own the business, to provide the value, provide the service. So if you can't do that for any amount of time, we don't want that to make everything kind of blow up.
Perfect. No, that makes sense. And like you say, you might not want to have some of these discussions, but it makes sense to have them in advance, because once they happen, it's kind of hard to plan for a disability or a death in the operation. You're really scrambling at that point in time to try and piece things together. So planning for that worst case scenario before it ever happens is probably the prudent thing to do in any business.
It is, and it's really challenging because I like to use a vehicle because it seems less heartless than
Sure,
a human.
sure.
But you can't get hail insurance after your truck's been hailed,
That's a fair point.
right? Like they're not going to give it to you full
Right.
of dents. We're unfortunately
Sure.
not any different. If you've
Right.
gotten a diagnosis and become very ill,
Right.
you can't get insurance anymore. So it is unfortunately one of those things that you have to look at when you don't need it,
Right.
which is just the less fun part of the job.
Fair enough. So how can a business owner effectively balance reinvesting profits into the business versus dealing with financial goals on the personal side? So to me, I think this is a big one kind of in relation to this farm family. Mom and dad are maybe looking to get out over the course of the next few years. They want to increase that time in Arizona. Child is looking to maybe keep back some of those profits because he's got to feed his family, he needs to keep growing the business, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you kind of balance out, to me, what would be maybe competing goals here from two different parties that are involved in this business?
Yes, and this is where things can be tricky, and this is what takes time when we
Okay.
talk about doing planning and it taking multiple meetings and sometimes years.
Right.
This is where communication, especially for farm families, becomes so key.
Okay.
Because you have to have that open conversation of mom and dad going, look, we didn't leave the farm or take a holiday for 25 years or 35
Right.
years or whatever it is. This is really important to us. We really want to do X, Y, and Z. And they need to be on the same page about that. And then the child that's taking it over is going, well, I want to modernize, I want to do things the new way, I want to double the land.
Right.
Whatever it is, and talking about, well, how do we make both work? Because especially in a farm, most times I see there isn't a huge amount of off-farm cash assets to fund retirement.
Right.
They're using the farm and the ongoing operation of the children or child and their new family taking it over to fund mom and dad's retirement.
For sure.
And depending on the size, this is when I find a lot of times the conversation starts coming in. Do we need to move from a partnership to should we look at a more formal type structure of an incorporation?
Okay.
Or is there going to be a separate farm partnership started over here that is the son and their families, and assets over time are sold from mom and dad over,
Gotcha.
so that is funding Arizona
Gotcha.
or whatever,
Whatever.
right?
Sure.
Because that is always going to be a multi-year process.
Correct.
Actually, truly, probably a multi-decade process.
I would agree.
So it's starting to have those talks, and as I find farms are pretty good at it, like they naturally talk about what a farm has meant to the family, what the goals are. It is usually, I believe a lot of times what I see is that intergenerational legacy is so important and so key, and something that they are all extremely proud of, that working together to make that happen is one of the hallmarks of why farms there are so many Central Alberta over 100-year farms.
For sure.
Is because, working on those transitions. We've just, had the good fortune over the last 20 years of the values of things going up so much.
Right.
That it is now having to bring in, us as experts to make sure that, a lot of times the family knows what they want to do and what the intent is.
Sure.
Now we just have to make sure that technically
Mm-hmm.
we can make that happen in the way that they're intending.
Right.
Because there can be a loss of translation
Sure.
between what Revenue Canada wants to see and what they want to see. So it's just making sure that we're doing that in conjunction and working together so that the end result is what everyone's looking for, and knowing that it's going to take some compromise, both from what the son and their family wants to do for an extension standpoint, and mom and dad are going like, it's been great, but I want a holiday, and how do we make that work?
Right.
And it's going to be different every year, and that's okay.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, to me, is the most important thing, that communication piece. Because like you say, values of land, across the country, Central Alberta, no different, have increased a lot over the last number of years. So, there's a lot of dollars involved with some of this succession planning. And just speaking from personal experience, I've seen where the dollars do weird things to people, and you can see families split apart. And I think at the end of the day, to me, a good succession plan is one that keeps that family together.
Yes.
Maybe you pay a bit extra in tax overall, but if everybody stays the same and we're still going to Thanksgiving and Christmas, etc. together, to me, there's far more value in that than saving a couple dollars and then everybody has just decided to not speak with each other for the rest of their lives. To me, that's not good succession planning. So starting that process early, clearly communicating those, thoughts and ambitions and hopes for the future, I think is important, because a lot of times I think, parents have it in their head that maybe child 1 wants to take over a business and child 2 has no interest. But maybe when you sit down and have that discussion, maybe it's the complete opposite. Maybe child 1 just felt forced into it, and then child 2 just never had the opportunity but would love to be involved. So, actually laying these things out, and they're probably not going to be easy discussions, but just having that communication piece open is a huge thing.
It's huge. And if you're the child taking over, right, and mom and dad have always kept it a little tighter to the vest,
Sure.
because traditionally, we didn't talk about money, talk about these things. Slowly start asking the questions and just talking about how you want to make sure that you're building it or continuing that legacy in a way that makes them proud in what you're doing. Because I agree, I've never had a family meeting where they're like, what I want to do? Make sure mom and dad hate all the choices that I'm making.
Right.
Taking the farm in a totally different direction, right? That's just not, that's not how people work, that's not how families are. So having those chats and starting with just, it doesn't need to be, all right, I've got all my papers, I got the lawyer, I got the accountant, mom and dad, let's go, we're gonna talk about this. No, just start with, this is what I would like to see.
Right.
What would you like to do? Do you want to still be at every seeding, every harvest?
Sure.
Do you want to go away for the winter? You can start those conversations before you have to bring in anybody from an expert standpoint. But it's much easier if everyone can be on a little bit of the same page ahead of time.
Perfect. So, when we're kind of looking at this, whether it's getting started in that business or growing that business, I know a lot of times with newly incorporated businesses, there's always going to be that personal guarantee that, ties them up to that business. I don't know, a lot of times I think that's just kind of the way it works. You kind of just build that business up till you can get away from that. Are there a few things that you would advise clients to say, these are a couple things that you should not put on the line when you're, thinking about risking personal assets when you're growing that business?
For me, I always advise to try to the very best of your ability to not use your home
Oh, okay.
as any kind of collateral for your business.
Okay.
And if you had any old RSPs from previous jobs, to try and keep those off limits as well. Because you really don't ever want to have to go home and have the conversation that the house has to go up for sale because, the business went a little bit sideways. So personal guarantees, like you say, are unfortunately a bit of a rite of passage as you're starting out and building that business until you can set a goal to try and work out of them.
Sure.
But I always advise to try your very, very best to not use your home as any sort of funding or collateral towards starting a new business.
And I think that's a good point. I mean, as a business owner, you put a lot on the line as far as dollars and time and, that effort for a long time to kind of see it get to that point where it's a little bit self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
But having that bit of a break where you can say, this is just ground that we're not going to go near, we're going to leave this alone because, you might put everything into a business and, things crop up like they did in 2020 and it's beyond your control regardless of what you do to make that business successful. So at least if you've got a bit of a separation on that home, you're out that business and you got to start over there, but at least you're not living in a cardboard box at the end of the week. So probably a good point. I know we kind of talked about this a little bit in certain circumstances, just in regards to business setbacks, as far as maybe having some key person insurance in place, setting something up as far as life insurance to deal with the passing of a shareholder or partner, something to that effect. Beyond that, is there anything that business owners can kind of put in place? Say they've got some shutdowns, they want to cover overhead costs. And what is something that kind of generally dictates maybe some of these bigger triggering events? Is there a certain agreement that needs to be put into place that would say, okay, when this event occurs, this is what happens?
Right. So this is where we need a few different documents.
Okay.
So whether you're incorporated or not, I would say it's actually more important, even when you're not incorporated, is to have some sort of shareholder or partnership agreement.
Okay.
Even if it's spouses.
Right.
Because all kinds of things happen. And a partnership agreement lays out if this happens.
Right.
If that, this happens. And with all documents, it's not a one and done situation. So an overview is every business should have some sort of partnership or business key man policy for structure for if this happens, this is going to happen. Personally, it should also be reflected in your will.
Okay.
And your power of attorney and your personal directive.
Okay.
Right? Because there's the business and then there's you, and if something happens to you, well, it affects both sides.
Yes.
It affects both sides. So make sure that they reflect each other, because we have seen times where the partnership agreement, or usually it's the will, wasn't updated after a business was started or incorporated, or a power of attorney doesn't address them. So make sure that they are looked at together all the time. I always recommend to people that we do a very thorough look and bring the lawyer in every 5 years
Okay.
to review them, to make sure that they're still accurate to what you want them to be as the business owner.
Sure.
Does this still truly reflect where the business is at, where our partnership's at, where we are personally? Have there been just a legal change? Is there a rule that's different that makes this not work the way we intend it to, right? Sometimes it's not because we have changed. It's because there's a rule that has changed that now makes it not work the same. So knowing that it's not just, sometimes I find you incorporated or you started your partnership, you went to the lawyer, got those first docs done, they gave you a boilerplate shareholder agreement or partnership agreement, and thankfully some of them do that because that's better than nothing.
Sure.
But then it's never looked at again.
Yes.
And it needs to be reviewed.
Yeah.
Because usually every 5 years we've had significant enough changes in our worlds, whether that's business or personal, or the combination of the two, that they need to be sort of had a once over.
For sure. So yeah, I think, as far as it goes with me and clients coming in, and, this would apply to that new, group of shareholders that are coming in, or it could, definitely apply here where mom and dad are moving out, child's coming in to take over, is, usually at those junctures, things are going fairly well. Either you're starting a new business and everyone's excited to see that going, or maybe you're starting this transition and mom and dad are excited at the possibilities to be going to Arizona. Son's excited at the possibility of taking the farm in a new direction. You're not wanting to necessarily plan for that particular day. You're planning, again, for those worst case scenarios. No one wants to talk about them, but it's important to have that, shareholder partnership agreement in place that, dictates well in advance, this is what happens if there's a disability or a death or a disagreement or whatever the case is. Because, a lot of these events, at some point, someone is going to pass away. That's just unfortunately the way life works. So if you are able to plan in advance, it's probably going to save you a lot of heartache, for sure. Could save you a bunch of tax, depending on how things play out there. So it's always important to kind of have these documents in place well ahead of time. So when those eventual setbacks do occur, you're well prepared for them.
And it forces everybody, as much as nobody likes it, to be on the same page.
Right.
Right now, nothing is not discussed. Everybody knows what the game plan's going to be. We all had to do those fire drills, right, at school.
Yep.
If the building catches on fire, what do you do? Where do you go? Where's the muster point? Right? This is the same thing for your business. If something goes sideways, the barn catches on fire, what do we do? It's not fun, but it's still something that it saves a lot of stress. Because what you don't want to have happen, and sometimes it's just something silly, is there was two people that had to sign for property tax or whatever, and they're not in the country.
Gotcha.
It can be as small as that this just means a lot less frazzled phone calls and emails and DocuSigns. So doesn't have to be big.
Right on. No, that's a good point. So I think kind of in closing, just want to look at, and this is very, pertinent to this family farm situation, is how does the business owner then have enough for personal savings while trying to grow that business? Son is trying to move things on. Parents need to see some retirement funds out of this, whether it was, they got to that particular point with that partnership and they said, maybe it's time to incorporate the farm operation. They move a bunch of equipment in there. Mom and dad are taking back a whole bunch of preferred shares there. And then son comes in and he's taking on the rest of the growth going forward. Is there a plan for the redemption of those shares? Are we doing this over 5, 10, however many years it is? Is that something, again, maybe that shareholder agreement, kind of touches on? What is the best way to kind of navigate some of these things? Is there, maybe a reason to bring holding companies in for certain assets, or to deal with certain circumstances.
And absolutely there is. This is when, the structure a lot of times of companies or partnerships really change.
Right.
This is when I see the most sort of movement from an actual framework.
Okay.
It's gone from, the farm was mom and dad, they did it as a partnership, they've just been adding equipment, bins, land,
Sure.
all those things, and going, well, now because asset values have gone up, now there's someone else coming in, how do we logistically transfer while providing cash flow to mom and dad?
Right.
And that can come in a couple of different forms. The simplest is the son that's taking over or the family member that's taking over, they have some sort of agreement done up that says, I'm going to basically pay you a pension, an income, for your life.
Okay.
And a lot of times we see in farms, like the home quarter and the home, we put something in there that they can live in it for as long as they choose.
Sure.
Sort of thing. And that, obviously transitions and changes over time. If they get to a place that they can't physically stay on the farm anymore, that's when we'll see the next level of change and amalgamation.
Okay.
If it is not a farm business or an incorporated business, it's when the business, the operating side of the company, gets to a spot where one of two things have happened. They're bringing in new ownership, so should we move the assets that the original owners, mom and dad, have made into their own holding company so that they can draw from that? That's their retirement money, that's their own built up pension.
Okay.
Or, hopefully, I think lots of people would like to get to a spot where they have the conversation with their accountant, they come in to see you, and you're like, we need to open a holdco because you have too much passive income in here. And we need to make sure that the company stays as it should. Those are good problems to have.
For sure.
And then we're using, in conjunction with the accountants, how to best pull money, whether that's dividends, shareholder loan paybacks, just straight salary, depends on how it's structured, out to fund non-business living in retirement. And sometimes this is where we get into how do we keep things equal when mom and dad are not around anymore.
Okay.
So I don't know if we can talk about that at the same time is,
Sure.
especially for farms, if we've got mom and dad and they have two children and one child is actively farming, has started partnering with mom and dad, it's going really well, everybody's happy, but the non-farming child is doing really well in their own right, they're off building their fabulous life and career, and they're, it's not that there's an issue or a problem, it's just they're not farming.
Sure.
But mom and dad want their legacy to be equal.
Right.
And it's challenging to do that with a farm,
It is.
right?
For
So
sure.
there's a couple of options. I've seen it where they assign certain pieces of land to the non-farming child, and the agreement is they then rent the land to their sibling that is actively farming.
Right. Right.
And they have first right to purchase the
Okay.
land from their sibling that's not
Sure.
farming.
Sure.
Or commonly we will see, depending on the tax situation, life insurance use them
Oh,
as an equalization payment because the surviving or the younger farming family member has taken over the farm, mom and dad pass away, and the life insurance policy is that equalized as close as it can be because it's never perfect
Sure.
to the non-farm child.
Right.
But again, those are discussions that ideally we're starting to have when mom and dad are in their 60s, and 70s, because it gets harder to do as they get older. There's not as many options because it's easier to make all these plans and put the pieces in place while everybody's healthy and good,
Right. 100%.
right?
And I think, like we mentioned earlier, if the intent is for mom and dad to, equalize that legacy of theirs, their financial assets, have that farm continue onwards, having that planning in place to ensure that things can continue on in that, sense going forward, that's going to be an important piece to get ahead of way before, something potentially happens to either of them. Because, when you're scrambling last minute, things tend to get a bit heated and things may not work out the way that mom and dad intended. So if you can put those plans in place, have the non-farming child involved in those discussions, because I think it's important to keep that family, cohesion together, then you're going to be able to come up with the best game plan that keeps family together going forward. And yeah, I mean, like you said, there are a number of options that you can put into place, whether it's that life insurance or having that rental income come across. And, you just need to kind of be willing to sit at that table and have the discussion to ensure that the family legacy keeps going onwards.
Right. And it's just knowing that it's not, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on the family, it's not a one conversation thing. And when I work with my families on especially legacy planning and succession planning, and even selling any business, is intent comes first. What's the goal? What are we trying to achieve? In a perfect world, when we can ignore tax rules, all of it, what would you like to see happen? And then I take that vision and try and find a way to find the closest way with the tools that we have, right? From a financial tool standpoint, and then from the accounting side, bringing you in and going, well, how do we, this is the vision. Here's the perfect idea of what they would like to see happen. This is perfect world. How do we get as close to that as possible? Because most business owners don't know all the intricacies and the ins and outs.
Sure.
So I always start there. We find out what the best case scenarios are, how we can make it work, and then I go back and go, here's the rules to the game. Here's what we can do to make this happen. Because there's always going to be pros and cons to everything. No matter what strategy you take.
Yep.
Partnership versus incorporation versus sole prop.
Sure.
There is always a pro and a con. It's just, I think it's really important to inform people with what they are. What are the rules to the game? So that you know which game you want to play.
Good point.
Right? If we know what the pitfalls could be or what the pros are, you can decide as the business owner, as the farm family, which set of risks are the most acceptable to you at this time. And then in 5 years, we're going to do it all again and reevaluate. Do you still have the same intent? Has something changed? And then, let's check our plan of what we've been doing. Does it still match? Does it still work for you? Is it still working for the family? Is everybody still good? Great, perfect. Off we go. If it's not, how do we adjust? And that's the ongoing process. The goal should always be, the conversation, I believe, with all your experts should be, your intent comes first. Everything else is there to support it. Because the perfect tax strategy, if it doesn't do anything you want, it's not that helpful.
That is a very good point.
Right? Like,
Yep.
I could tell someone, well, this 5-year GIC has the best rate, but if they're going to use the money in a year
Right.
to buy another quarter of land, well, that's not helpful.
Right.
So intent first, product, strategy, policy, legal document, whatever, second, to support the goal.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, looking at things every 5 years. Because, maybe a new grandkid came into the mix, or maybe someone got married in that particular point in time, or whatever the case is. like you said, I think the intent is probably to see that family legacy go on as opposed to see that really amazing tax plan be put into implementation or that amazing investment strategy
Yeah.
get put into place. At the end of the day, you probably don't care how you get from A to B as long as if you get to that goal that you see for you and your family down the road.
That's it, right? Most people, they want it to be as lucrative as possible.
Sure.
Obviously, we all do.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, we want to get from A to B,
For sure.
right? We don't get up. We have a new partner at the firm that talks about you don't get into your vehicle. Most of us, anyways, don't get into our vehicle and just aimlessly drive. We have a destination in mind.
Hopefully.
And we use Google Maps or something in order to get us from A to B. This is the same thing.
That is a good point.
We're going to look at the fine print and is it working, really regularly? Are we still on track to make these things happen? And then do, a 40,000 foot view, just like you do with your business. We do 5-year business plans every year.
Right.
So we're doing the same thing when it comes to legacy, selling the business, that transition to the next generation.
Perfect. Really enjoyed the conversation. Is there anything in closing that you wanted to just throw out there for the farm family?
It can seem, this is a lot.
It is.
It can seem really, really overwhelming.
For sure.
And for lots of farm families, for mom and dad, that farm was, their first thing together that
Sure.
they started building and growing. It feels like one of the kids, right? It's everything. So, start wherever you are, start with that next step. Start with one thing at a time. Reach out to somebody, an expert, whether you are really comfortable with your accountant or your lawyer or your financial planner that you work with, and start having those conversations, ideally years before you want to see it happen. But just start where you are and move towards it one step at a time. You don't have to do this all in a 1-hour meeting, I promise.
Yeah. It's not about coming up with some sophisticated plan in an hour. It's just about getting the ball rolling.
Yeah.
So you can eventually get to that point that you want to be at.
Yeah.
Perfect. So Colleen, I just want to say thanks again for hopping on the podcast. It was great to have you on again for a second episode. I know you've provided a lot of value here for the farm family as they transition that business, that farm from generation 1 to number 2. If the audience wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
So you can look me up on LinkedIn. Just search for my name, Colleen Gillam-Judd. I have a website up as well, juddwealth.ca. And you can find me at either of those places, or I'm here in Red Deer, so if you Google me, my phone number will come right up. So
Perfect.
If you're in town, stop by, we'll have a coffee.
Right on. I will put all that information in the show notes so you can touch base with Colleen whenever it works best for you. For the Tax Talk Podcast, I'm Jared Plon. Thanks again for watching. Take care, and we'll talk soon.